Should the Denver Broncos take a look at quarterback in the 2023 NFL Draft with their third-round pick? We tell you why they should, and we also tell you why they shouldn't on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos Country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in and making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day. Every single day, you can get this podcast free and available everywhere you get your podcasts in audio format, or whether you want to watch on YouTube, you can do that as well. Do us a favor, though. Hit that subscribe or that follow button down below so you never miss out on a day's worth of Broncos news, content, coverage, and more. When you want Broncos coverage straight to the point, no muss, no fuss, this is the place to be. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger. He's the site expert, predominantly orange.com, and Sayre's the NFL scout and combine was ongoing all throughout last week. Quarterbacks tested, and while the Broncos aren't specifically focused, in our opinion, on quarterback itself because they have Russell Wilson, it's hard not to maybe get caught up in the discussions about, hey, should Denver maybe take a look at a quarterback to develop in the NFL draft? Now, no first-round pick, no second-round pick. We're well aware of that. But they do have two premier third-round picks to start off the action there, my friend. So let's dive into that on today's episode of the show. Let's talk about why the Broncos should look at quarterback in a 2023 NFL draft.
Well, it's a fun question, Cody, and certainly if you look at my Twitter mentions, maybe even yours at this point, who knows, you might get a lot of different opinions from people in Broncos country, right? It kind of feels like everybody is not necessarily, it's not like you're split down the middle on this. I think people are more than excited about the option of drafting a quarterback depending on where it is. I specifically threw out this question, would you trade what is required, or would you put together a package if you love somebody like Anthony Richardson, who absolutely went out and blew up the scouting combine? Of course, most people expected that, but if you make a move like that, you'd have to give up a lot. Obviously, you'd have to give up your two, like you said, the two premier third round picks. You'd have to maybe give up 2024 first rounder, 2025 first rounder, and then some, maybe to a team that's really trying to build for the future, like the Chicago Bears. I'm not saying the Broncos get the number one pick. What we are talking about here is the fact of the matter that Russell Wilson, he's coming off a bad year, I think, to say the least, right? I think everybody who watched Broncos football last year could tell it wasn't the best year for Russell Wilson ever. And I think even as the hiring process was going along, like Sean Payton kind of being courted by different teams out there, we heard reports and rumors like, would he decline the Broncos job because of Russ? Is the job even really tied to Russ? We don't know where this team really stands with Russell Wilson beyond this year. I think everybody's kind of reasonably assuming that it makes sense to give Russ this season under Sean Payton to see, can he get things together? Otherwise, would the Broncos actually move on in 2024? Because it was a bad year for Russ last year. And I think that leads to this kind of assumption, maybe, is 2024 even guaranteed for Russ? Is he guaranteed to be on the roster?
I think that's a valid question to kind of throw out there because there's no guarantee necessarily out there, right? We all think that he'll play better, but there's no guarantee that Russ is going to play better this upcoming season for the Broncos. I also think, to that point that you mentioned there, you have a brand new coaching staff in place. You have a quarterback coach in Davis Webb who's going to be really working heavily under the right hand of Sean Payton, who's going to be leading the offense alongside Joe Lombardi. We know that Lombardi's the OC, but Payton will be calling the plays. Payton's fingerprints will be all over the Broncos offense, not to mention they'll be all over the quarterback position. So part of me wonders this, with Sean Payton's emphasis on quarterback development, and I think that we've seen throughout his tenure as head coach, he's had Drew Brees, yes, but he's also had some other quarterbacks who've came in. We've mentioned former Bronco Teddy Bridgewater, former Bronco Trevor Siemian. For some reason, former Broncos were flocking to Sean Payton there, and he was able to get valuable production out of them. They were able to win games with those guys at QB in several instances. So the question you have to ask yourself, with a brand new coaching staff led by Sean Payton, do they believe that 2023 is the year that Denver looks at maybe getting a younger guy, setting a behind for maybe a couple years, and developing him. Now, I want to really push this envelope right here, right? Because while we believe Russ will play better, there's no guarantee that he won't. If Russ struggles, if you go with a young guy, if you draft a young guy with one of your third-round picks, you can essentially sit him behind not only just Russell Wilson, even if Russ struggles, but it also, I think, goes back to the point where you and I were talking last week. We believe that Denver should bring in a veteran quarterback regardless, and then you can continue that development rather than rushing a young guy to start, which we see so many teams make that mistake.
We do. And I think that's exactly why this is kind of the ideal situation to sort of say, hey, we're going to bring somebody in, a young player. Like you said, you got Davis Webb, very, very fresh quarterbacks coach. You got kind of that brain trust out there with John Morton, maybe a little bit of a secret weapon coming over from that Detroit Lions coaching staff, Joe Lombardi, Sean Payton himself. I think there's obvious reasons why taking a young quarterback makes a ton of sense for the Denver Broncos, even if they wanted to do that high. And I know that people are looking at all sorts of different options, from Hendon Hooker, who, of course, was reported over the weekend by Ian Rappaport that it sounds like he's progressing to be ready by the start of the regular season after tearing his ACL in, I think, November it was. So it's just guys like him or a Jaron Hall out of BYU or Tanner McKee from Stanford. Like, if you're not getting anybody in the first round, why would you not open up to the possibility of a third-round QB? I guess it depends on what veteran you sign in free agency, like we've been talking about here. It's this whole thing of, like, we finally have an infrastructure in place for a quarterback, a young quarterback, to kind of succeed and thrive. It helps push Russell Wilson, and really it could push him one of two different ways, right? It could push him to, okay, man, he's really crumbling under the pressure, or wow, he really stepped up after you brought in these quarterbacks and he started to play like the old Russ. I think that there's just really no downside to it. QBs are the most valuable currency in the NFL. It's good business to bring guys like that in. And let me just reiterate this, and people can disagree with this all they want, Cody, but I don't believe if the Broncos go into the 2023 NFL draft with a need for a starter at any position, waiting until pick 68 and 69 to take that guy, that's just ridiculous. It's horrible malpractice of free agency, especially knowing that your assets are limited. So you can't go into the NFL draft saying, we still need a starting right tackle. That's not going to be the case. At least I hope not, right? And if it is, man, shame on George Payton and this whole front office and coaching staff for not getting that fixed. Free agency is where you need to fill these needs. The NFL draft is where you capitalize on great players. Take the best players. Don't fill needs in round 3. That's the most ridiculous idea that you could have. People thought my Anthony Richardson idea was ridiculous. Taking a starter at pick number 68 or taking somebody who you need to start at pick number 68, that's even worse idea. So that's where I'm at, Cody. Quarterbacks are the most valuable position in the league. Why would you not consider drafting one with a pick 68? I don't. Who cares? It's pick number 68. You want to get the best player there. If you could get Hendon Hooker, he's probably the best player on the board at that point. So I guess we'll kind of see as the draft gets closer. I'm on my soapbox right now, Cody, because this is a very hot topic. But you have to get quarterbacks in the building that you can develop. The Patriots did it with Tom Brady on the roster, right? They drafted guy after guy, year after year. Some hit, some didn't. And I think that's, what happened when some of them hit, but they couldn't play. You trade Jimmy Garoppolo for a second. You trade Jacoby Brissett for whatever they ended up getting for him from the Colts. Teams are desperate for QBs, and when they play or practice for Sean Payton, they're going to be valuable to other teams.
Well, I think if we've seen anything from George Payton and even Sean Payton, they never, I think when you look back at some of their picks, Payton with Denver, the other Payton in New Orleans, I don't think they've ever drafted based on need, right? And I agree with you. You have to address your needs in free agency, your major needs. And then the draft, and I think specifically when you're picking in the third round, these are depth pieces. This is what George Payton has highlighted. So we will see how that plays a role in the NFL draft. But these are the reasons why we believe the Broncos should take a look at quarterback in a 2023 NFL draft. But why should they not look at a quarterback in this upcoming draft? You'll get that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends at Built Bar. And if you're looking for a delicious treat, but you don't want all the fat and all the calories, then you have to try a Built Bar. We just got through the holidays, and I know my goal is to eat a little bit healthier this year. And if you're like me and you want to eat healthier but don't want to compromise taste, then, well, Built Bar is exactly for you. What makes Built Bar so good? Well, first off, they're covered in 100% milk chocolate. They're soft, they're easy to chew, and they come in a wide variety of amazing flavors like peanut butter brownie, coconut almond, and churro. They have also different bars like the Puff Bars, which you can try as well. And as we've encouraged you to get them at Built.com, you can also now get them locally at your local Walmart or King Soopers. You can get a box of 4 Built Bars at your local Walmart in the pharmacy area, or you can go to Sam's Club and get a bulk box of 13 Built Bars today. 17 grams of protein, 130 calories, and only 4 grams of sugar. It is the best protein bar that is out there on the market today. Try it today and thank us later. Why should the Denver Broncos not take a look at the quarterback position in the 2023 NFL Draft? Thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. Every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format, or whether you watch on YouTube. We appreciate you so much. If you're watching on YouTube, do us a favor, hit that like button on the video, comment for the algorithm, and engage with other members in Broncos Country. And if you ever want to tweet us, you can always do that at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. But continuing our conversation on today's episode of the show, Sayre, going into maybe why the Broncos shouldn't take a look at quarterback in the 2023 NFL Draft. And I'll start things off right here by simply saying you have to maybe take that chance and that gamble, right? With Russell Wilson, you committed to a long-term deal with him. And while there are parameters where Denver could eventually move on in a year, 2 years from now, if things simply do not work out with Russ, you took a chance on him. And there is a chance, right? There is a chance that he turns things around and gets back to the quarterback that we know that he can be, that's moving out of the pocket, throwing on the run. Like Sean Payton has said it himself, he wants to build a playlist around Russ's greatest hits, and he wants to maximize that within the offense. That's going to be part of it, but we all know this offense that Denver is going to have is really going to be predicated on a strong run game, which tells us we know that the offensive line is going to be a major emphasis this offseason, probably in free agency more so than the NFL draft. They could draft some talent, some developmental guys behind, but this is the year where you really have to make things work with Russell Wilson. You have to see and you have to be sure. So in my opinion, I think that's where it goes into our scenario we talked about last week. You roll with Russ, you bring back Brett Rippon, and you add another quarterback to the roster. You have 3 quarterbacks, or if you want to go with Rip once again and Jared Guarantano, you can do that as well. How do you feel about this in the event that Denver does not look at a quarterback in the 2023 NFL Draft?
Well, let's play that, that role here for a second and just talk through that, because I think that's a possibility, right? You only got 5 draft picks. That's one of the first and foremost reasons. I think that the fact that you only have 5 picks means that, okay, we do want to, like I mentioned in the first segment, you don't want to go in drafting for need, but at the same time, maybe you feel like you really need depth at other positions, like wide receiver, like on the offensive line, like on the D line, like at safety, a corner, linebacker, potentially. We don't know what's going to all happen there. So, I mean, you only have 5 picks right now. George Payton, we know he's going to probably add some more picks to that old war chest there. But at the same time, you have limited draft capital. Maybe you don't want to spend one on a quarterback, and that's a reasonable thing to do. I think that's very much so a possibility here in terms of what you're talking about. Hey, why not to draft a quarterback in the 2023 class? You also just might think, well, if we commit to somebody in the 2023 class, depending on where you take them, let's say you do get a Hendon Hooker in round 3, does that prevent you from going after somebody in 2024 that you really like? I'm not saying you're going to get Caleb Williams. I'm not saying you're going to get Drake May. I mean, I think people need to kind of take that off the board for the Denver Broncos. Even if they, even if we want to talk about hypothetical trades, ain't nobody trading the picks that are going to land you Caleb Williams and Drake May. In my opinion, Cody, I just don't see that happening. Those are too valuable of players. So whoever has picks 1 and 2 next year, you can pretty much lock it in. And I don't think the Broncos floor is going to be that low. If it wasn't bad enough in 2022, it's not going to be that bad in 2023, in my opinion. So I think those are a couple of reasons. First and foremost, you got limited draft capital. Secondly, maybe you don't really love anybody in this class, and that's okay. That's an okay place to be. If you say you love the first round guys, great. You don't have a first round pick, too bad. If you don't love anybody else beyond that, why would you take them?
I think those are great questions to kind of throw out there. And look, I think everything is fluid with this team right now. I mean, they could, at some point between now and the start of the NFL draft, they could acquire a first-round pick. They could trade some players. They could acquire a second-round pick. I also think, and I'm glad that you brought that up, right? If you don't love anybody in this current class, right, that you feel like, hey, we can develop this guy, and in several years, he could eventually take over to be the starter, right? I think that has to be the DNA if you are going to take a quarterback. You have to know for a certainty that, hey, with a concerted effort on player development and this guy learning this system and maybe even learning behind a guy like Russell Wilson for a few years, you have every opportunity to maximize that investment by getting those reps. Now, I do agree with the sense that, yes, I think you have to have reps in order to continue to progress, but as we've seen, it's an anomaly. It's a rarity to see it happen. But there are players who have sat and who have learned, who have gotten in and all of a sudden have made plays. It's hard to gauge that in the preseason. And look, I think we might see Russ for a preseason game this year, but I don't think we're going to see him too much because, once again, you don't want to see your key guys going out there and getting hurt in a meaningless preseason game. That makes things very, very hard. Now, you could also be in a situation, I think this is maybe where it appeals to George Payton, who's even mentioned that, hey, if there's nobody there at 67, 68, which I did forget, it was 68, 69, but 67, 68 now because of the Miami Dolphins forfeiture of their pick due to the whole tampering thing that they had going on, the NFL's punishment. If there aren't two guys back-to-back at those spots, and there's another team that wants to get there, George Payton has all the tools at his disposal, depending on what they do in free agency, to say, you know what? You want this pick? Give me this pick next year, and maybe they could even recoup a second-round pick. Maybe they could even recoup, add even more capital there. Maybe they could even do a draft day trade where they give a pick and a player, and they get essentially more capital for a team to move up. I mean, everything right now is on the table. I think this is what makes the offseason probably the most exciting because it could go this way. It could go that way. Depends on, do you want it? Do you need it? I mean, there's all these things I think you have to factor in. I know fans feel certain ways about trading capital. I just can't imagine a world where Broncos fans are going to be like, all right, you know what? Trade your 2024 first, your 2025 first-round pick as well. Because what did we hear, Sayre? When they traded for Russell Wilson, the whole mantra was F them picks. And now that, obviously the Broncos struggle, they're like, oh my gosh, we have no picks. So I don't think Broncos Country is going to be on board with that notion there, but I think that you could look at a wide variety of guys in the 2024 NFL draft class as well. And Broncos Country, we're eager for your thoughts as well on this discussion as to maybe why the Broncos should not look at quarterbacks in this upcoming draft. But another thing we're going to do on today's episode of the show, Broncos Country chimed in on the question that we asked as to whether or not the Broncos should look in the third round at acquiring a quarterback. Broncos Country had a wide variety of different responses. You'll get that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But I wanted to tell you real quick here about what we have going on here, the Locked On Podcast Network. We have a newsletter that you can check out now as well. Make sure you go to lockedonpodcast.com. You can check out our website. There's a newsletter where you can sign up for free. It's in the top right-hand corner. Click on that, enter your information, and you can sign up for the free NFL Draft newsletter, which is a first in this industry. And then when you scroll down the list, you can add your favorite NBA teams, NFL teams, NHL teams, MLB teams, college teams, and more, so you get information that is predicated off of those teams that you root for every single day in your life as a sports fan. The Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Broncos Country shared their thoughts on whether or not the Broncos should look at a quarterback with the 2023 NFL Draft, particularly with two premier picks in the third round. Just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. When you want short, sweet, to the point Broncos information, this is it every single day. Sayre, let's continue on with our conversation. You threw your question out to Broncos Country about, maybe Anthony Richardson. I threw a question out there about, do you look with your third round picks that you have in this year's NFL Draft? And one of the first responses, we can't get to every single one of them because there were a lot, but one of the first responses I got came from Roger Hoodell, which is a GOAT username on Twitter. And his response simply was to that question, if the Broncos did that, they would be settling for mediocrity. And I can see maybe where he's coming from on that, because I even asked the question as to how so, and his response is more along the lines of, well, you have other holes you need to fill. And I think it goes back to the conversation that you and I had. Our hope is that Denver isn't addressing holes, major holes, key holes on this team in the draft, particularly when they don't have a first or second round pick, hopefully in free agency that is there. But I also see maybe where he's coming from, that, hey, if this isn't the best player out there that maybe can fulfill a position later on down the road, I can see that. I don't know if that's mediocrity, though.
Yeah, that's a tough one because it's to the Anthony Richardson question specifically, right? It's like, where are you going to get a better athlete at the position, right? I mean, the Broncos aren't going to be in position to get Caleb Williams or Drake May. I think we got to just kind of come to grips with that idea. This team is not going to bottom out at such a level to get to that spot. And like I said, I doubt the teams that are in position to get them, because you're going to have to go out and earn the right to pick those guys, right? You're going to have to be so bad that you're winning maybe 1 or 2 games this coming season. That's not going to be the Denver Broncos, barring catastrophic injuries, which we pray do not happen. Like, this is the thing. Like, Anthony Richardson I don't know who's going to be QB3, QB4 in next year's draft class. Anthony Richardson is a freak among freaks. You don't feel like Sean Payton could work with this guy along with Joe Lombardi, John Morton, Davis Webb, the whole crew of them? Like, that, this is the infrastructure that you wanted to set up for a quarterback to come in and have success. And we talked about this on the show when the Broncos were looking for another head coach, Cody. It can't be just based on Russell Wilson. If Russell Wilson has success, that seems like a win-win for everybody. If he doesn't have success, this coaching staff is set up so that the next guy can have success, right? You want to make sure that you have the answer to the question, was it really Russ in 2022? You want to have the definitive answer to that question by the end of 2023. Now, a number of Broncos fans, Cody, jumping into your mentions, mine as well, they're talking about Hendon Hooker. Like, he seems like the guy that, okay, he was on pace for maybe a Heisman Trophy campaign before that ACL injury. If he's available at 68 or 67 or 68, which are just not quite as nice of picks as 68 and 69, right? If he's available at one of those slots, do you take him? And that's where everybody's kind of seeing like, that's like, pennies on the dollar type of proposition. They're talking about somebody that maybe you were talking in the, the mid to late first round a couple months back, and now you could get him at 67 or 68. That right there is a bargain that Broncos Country seems on board for. It's just interesting. It feels like maybe Paxton Lynch has kind of scared a lot of people off from really wanting to invest heavily at that position in the draft.
Hey, I understand that too, because I think if I were a GM, and like I said, for John Elway, he had an infatuation with, tall quarterbacks with the big arm. And Von Miller was even at the Combine this past week talking about how, he's just going to, he knows how to build a defense. I do think that when you look at maybe roster construction, I think a guy like George Payton, because of his experience as a scout, I honestly feel like that is where a really big advantage is for very good NFL GMs. If you've been a scout and you know how to look for players, what to look for in players specifically, I think it's interesting to ponder. Like with Hooker, as I said, he's going to be ready for the regular season, but you're not going to need him for the regular season at all, which I think kind of bodes to that notion that, hey, if you believe that this guy can be the guy down the road, yes, you take that chance. In terms of Anthony Richardson, I mean, a lot of conversation now because of the athleticism. A lot of people are talking about, hey, he might be even a top 5 pick now. And I get how the combines can skew things. You have to look at production. Is he going to be a starter, in his first season in the NFL? I think there's a multitude of things you can look at, like the Baltimore Ravens, who apparently there's more interest now on potentially trading Lamar Jackson. Could they trade away Lamar Jackson to get capital to maybe get a guy like Anthony Richardson in that offensive design in Baltimore? Those are things you have to throw out there. But then again, remember every year during the quarterback class, we're like, okay, this is a first-round quarterback. This is a first-round quarterback. Last year, we're like, Malik Willis is going to go round 1. No, it didn't happen. It ended up being Kenny Pickett, who we never thought would be a round 1 pick. So it's super hard to see how things work. I understand where Broncos fans' skepticism comes from, but I want to get to our final one here. It comes from J_Willie123 ABC. That's a very clever name. I like that. He says, too many other holes to fill knowing that Russell Wilson will be on the team the next few years. There's a lot of talent in next year's draft. And Sayre, you and I have talked about this. I think that's a fair point, right? If you don't believe that there is a guy that you feel like can develop and will be ready to step in whenever Russ is done in this year's NFL draft, maybe you look at next year's. I know our good friend Mike Kliss is even throwing out next year's draft as something because maybe during that window, it's going to run course with not only when Sean Payton is up for a contract extension or you're going to move on, but also with Russell Wilson as well.
Right. And that's something that you certainly have to consider in all of this is just like, okay, maybe we reset the clock at a little bit later of a time, right? Give Russ a year, kind of, gauge things after the season and then approach the NFL draft maybe with a little bit more aggressive of a mindset in 2024 when you do have a first round pick to work with. Now, according to the trade value chart, which I don't think teams look at strictly, of course, but I think it's pretty accurate over time, picks 67 and 68 are roughly worth like the 38th through the 40th pick in round 2. So you're talking about those are way more valuable assets. Like people say, oh, the Broncos have no draft picks, right? Those are pretty valuable assets, which is to the point of Jay Willie here, right? I mean, you're talking about filling holes. You've got 2 pretty valuable assets there to be able to fill holes. Again, where are you filling? Are you filling those holes looking ahead to the 2024 depth chart, or are you doing something like, remember when the Broncos took Damari Mathis in round 4? There was no expectation that he was going to come in and start in 2022, other than, hey, Ronald Darby gets injured, maybe Damari Mathis comes in and starts some games for you. Well, that obviously ended up happening, but the Broncos didn't draft him saying we need to fill a hole at the cornerback position. I think some of it is semantics. Others of it is really your team building philosophy. As all of us armchair general managers sitting here, your philosophy may be to go into the draft and fill holes. My personal philosophy, Cody, is the exact opposite. I want to go into the NFL draft free as a bird, willing and able to take anybody that tickles my fancy that can help my team be better, not just maybe now, but down the line. You have to look at these situations, especially at a premium position, whether you're talking about offensive tackle, quarterback, wide receiver, corner, these expensive positions. Yes, you can go in and fill holes, but at the same time, man, you really don't want to be in a position to have to do that, because let's throw out a hypothetical situation here. You go into the 2023 draft still needing a center to snap the ball to Russell Wilson. Are you going to go into this season, which is apparently a make or break year for Russ, with a rookie center on the team, at a 3rd round rookie center? Remember, the Broncos got Lloyd Cushenberry in round 3. So I don't think, Cody, that's a smart idea. I don't think it's a smart idea. I don't think it's a wise idea. I would love to see them fill some of these gaps on the roster in the draft, but taking players that need to start right away, I simply can't get on board with it.
I agree with that. I'm with you 110% on that. I think philosophically, you and I are very similar on a lot of these things. And look, Broncos Country, we want to know how you view things. What would your philosophy be if you were a general manager as it pertains to building this Broncos team, addressing needs, the free agency side of things, the NFL draft? Drop them in the YouTube comment section down below. If you're listening on your favorite audio podcasting platform, tweet us on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. But that will wrap up today's episode of the show. The franchise tag deadline is approaching, and while we don't think the Broncos will franchise tag Draymond Jones, things could change. Could they extend him by then? We'll see how things go this week. We'll have you covered every step of the way here, Locked On Broncos.